Today we're going to be solving equations in factored form. Before we do this, I want you to look at this problem here. Now this is not an equation in factored form, but it is something that I want you to think about before we get started. If you look at this problem, it says 7 times a equals 0. Now we know, based on what we know about multiplication, that both of these things here are factors. 7 times a, when I multiply those two factors, gives me a product of 0. Now, we also know, looking at this problem, that a has to equal 0. And we know that because in order to get a product of 0, you have to have at least one factor that equals 0. Well, this is going to help us solve equations in factored form. If I have an equation that equals 0, that's factored, I know that one of these two factors, either this factor here or this factor here, has to equal 0. And I know this because if I multiply this times 0, b minus 4 times 0, that will give me an answer of 0. Or, I know that if this is 0, right here, then I know that 0 times 2b plus 5 also equals 0. So once you get an equation that's equal to 0 and it's factored, in order to figure out what the variable stands for, you just make sure each of these factors equals 0 and you can solve for your missing variable. So, b minus 4, I'm going to make that factor equal 0, and then I'm going to solve it. I'm going to add 4 to both sides, and I find out that b equals 4. To find out my second possibility for b, I set 2b plus 5 equal to 0, and then I solve it. I'm going to subtract 5 on both sides. That gives me 2b equals negative 5, and then I need to isolate that b, divide by 2, and I find out that b equals negative 5 over 2. So that tells me in this problem that b could be either 4 or negative 5 over 2. Because I have two factors, I also have two possibilities for what b could equal. Okay. Now sometimes they won't give you a factored equation. Sometimes you'll have an equation that equals 0, but it won't be factored. Since this is not factored, I can't say one of these two things has to be 0 because I'm not multiplying anymore. The steps that we use now, once we have an equation equal to 0, is the first thing I want to do is factor this. Since I only have two terms, I can't use grouping, so I'm going to look at this and find my GCF. My GCF of both of these terms is 10x. So I'm going to divide 10x from both of these terms to figure out what I get in my parentheses. 10x squared divided by 10x is going to leave me with x. Negative 20x divided by 10x will leave me with negative 2. Now that I have a factored equation, I know that either this factor right here has to equal 0, or this factor has to equal 0. So my step is to make each factor equal 0, and then solve. Divide both of these by 10, and I see that x could be 0, or over here I'm going to add 2 to both sides, and I see that x could also be 2. So for this problem, x is either going to be 0 or 2. Now there's one last situation you might see like this, and that is where they give you an equation but it's not equal to 0. Well, first thing we have to do is make this equal 0. The easiest way to do that is to take this 18x and subtract it, because 18x minus 18x is going to be 0. If I do it on one side, I have to do it on the other. So what I'm going to have here is 3x squared minus 18x equals 0. So now I have an equation that equals 0. It needs to be factored. So again, two terms. I'm going to look for my GCF, which is going to be 3x. I'm going to pull that 3x out of each of these terms here. And that's going to leave me with x minus 6. So now I have an equation equal to 0 that is in factored form. So I know either this factor right here equals 0, or I know that this factor has to equal 0. So I set each factor equal to 0, and then I'm just going to solve. Divide each side here by 3, and I see that x could be 0 on the right-hand side here. I'm going to add 6 to both sides, and I see that x could be 6. So I know for this problem that x is either going to be 0 or 6.